If you were asked to name the great rival civilizations of the ancient world, you'd hear about Rome and Carthage, Greece and Persia, as well as Egypt and Babylon. What you probably wouldn't hear is Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, the three kingdoms that shared a peninsula and a cultural heritage, spending nearly 800 years locked in one of the most consequential rivalries from East Asian history. Korea's Three Kingdoms period is one of the most overlooked chapters in ancient history outside of East Asia. That's a big mistake, because what happened on the Korean peninsula between the 1st century BCE and 668 CE shaped not just Korea, but Japan and China. Furthermore, this affected the broader cultural and political landscape of an entire region. These weren't small, isolated tribes scrapping over farmland. These were sophisticated states with centralized governments, advanced militaries, deep trade networks, and cultural output that still echoes in modern Korea today. If we were to jump into all three, we would need to start with Silla, which is the oldest of the three. Founded around 57 BCE by a ruler named Baekje in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, Silla began as a confederation of Jinhan tribes centered around a capital called Seorabeol, or the city we now know as Gyeongju. The founding legend says Hyokkios emerged from a shining egg discovered near the Nahul River, which tells you something about how Silla's rulers understood their own origins. What Silla built from that foundation was impressive in ways that go beyond legend. The capital grew quickly as the kingdom accumulated wealth, so Silla's position in the southeast gave it access to a port network, including the port of Ulsan that connected it to China, Japan, and Persia. Pointing further west, goods flowed in both directions. From gold, ceramics, and lacquerware went out, Chinese goods, and the ideas that traveled with trade came in. Silla sat at the western terminus of the Silk Road in a way that most people don't associate with Korea, and that position shaped everything, starting with its economy and eventually affecting the whole religion. Buddhism arrived officially in Silla in 527 CE, so the impact was immediate and total. It reshaped the government, the arts, the architecture, and the moral framework of the entire society. Buddhist temples and monasteries became centers of learning. The artistic output of the period tells the whole story on its own. The leftover tomb complexes at Hwarang reflects a civilization operating at a high level of cultural sophistication. Militarily, Silla was never the largest force on the peninsula, but it was experienced, disciplined, and centralized in a way that made it consistently effective. Because of that, Silla had something the other kingdoms often lacked: a long-term strategic instinct that would eventually prove decisive. But one of the most striking expressions of that instinct was the Hwarang, an elite corps of young warriors, sometimes called the Flower Knights, drawn from promising youth and trained not just in combat but in literature and the arts. The idea was to produce not just soldiers, but complete human beings who could lead. And this ended up working, since the Hwarang became one of the most formidable military and cultural forces in Korean history, now Baekje. And this one deserves more attention than it usually gets. Founded in 18 BCE by a king named Onjo on the Han River in the northwest, Baekje expanded southwest through military conquest, acquiring some of the most fertile farmland on the peninsula and building access to both the Yellow Sea and the South Sea. That maritime access was everything, as Baekje became the greatest seafaring power of the three kingdoms, so dominant on the water that historians have called it the Phoenicia of East Asia. Only after the ancient Mediterranean civilization that built its empire on maritime trade and cultural transmission. If put in comparison, it holds up. Baekje's shipbuilding and navigation capabilities allowed it to move people and materials across the region at a scale the other kingdoms couldn't match. And what those ships carried wasn't just cargo. They carried culture from China, where Baekje absorbed a writing system, advancing in architecture and Buddhism, which arrived in Baekje in 384 CE, more than a century before it reached Silla. From Baekje, that knowledge and those cultural traditions flowed directly into Japan. Baekje monks, scholars, and merchants made the crossing to Yamato Japan. They embedded themselves so deeply into Japanese society that certain elite Japanese families traced their lineage directly back to Baekje immigrants. The Kudara no Konekishi clan is one documented example, a family whose roots in Baekje shaped Japanese aristocratic culture for generations. The relationship between Baekje and Japan is one of the more underappreciated connections in East Asian history, with significant elements of art and governance which all passed through Baekje before it reached Japan. In a very real sense, Baekje was the cultural bridge between the Asian mainland and the Japanese archipelago. That's not just a small role. That's a civilization that shaped the trajectory of an entire neighboring country. And then there's Goguryeo, which is considered the toughest, the largest, and by almost any military measure the most formidable of the three. Founded in 37 BCE by King Dongmyong near the Yalu River in the mountainous north, Goguryeo was a kingdom shaped by its geography in the most direct way possible. The mountains that surrounded it were a natural fortress. The people who grew up in them were harder and more accustomed to defending difficult terrain than almost any opponent they faced. Goguryeo battled the different successive Chinese dynasties, including the Sui dynasty, which launched multiple massive invasions and was repelled each time at enormous cost. The failure of the Sui invasions of Goguryeo is considered by some historians to have been a contributing factor in the collapse of the Sui dynasty itself. In other words, Goguryeo defeated one of the most powerful empires in the world and sent it into terminal decline. The kingdom's government was hierarchical and stable, built around a military aristocracy that kept order even as external pressure mounted. And like Silla, Goguryeo understood its own origins as divine. The rulers believed themselves descended from heavenly sources, which gave the kingdom a sense of destiny that helped hold it together through centuries of conflict. The peak of Goguryeo's power came under Gwanggaeto the Great, who ruled from 391 to 413 CE and expanded the kingdom's territory dramatically, later pushing into Manchuria, parts of Mongolia, and establishing Goguryeo as the dominant military power in the region. His achievements were significant enough that a massive stone monument, in specific the Gwanggaeto Stele, was erected in his honor as one of the largest stone inscriptions in East Asian history. Here's the thing about modern Korea's name, which comes from Goguryeo, not from Silla, which eventually unified the peninsula, not from Baekje, which shaped Japan's cultural development. The name Korea and its Chinese equivalent, Goryeo, derives directly from the kingdom that in many ways defined the fierce, independent spirit of the northern peninsula for nearly 7 centuries. For over 500 years, these three kingdoms traded, fought, allied, betrayed each other, and competed for dominance across the peninsula and into Manchuria. The balance of power shifted constantly, so no single kingdom could deliver a knockout blow. And then in 645 CE, the situation changed in a way that would determine how the entire story ended. Silla was in serious trouble because Goguryeo and Baekje had formed an alliance and were hitting Silla repeatedly, devastating the country from multiple directions. Isolated and running out of options, Silla's queen Seondeok made a decision that required both courage and a clear-eyed reading of the geopolitical landscape. She approached the Tang dynasty, whom was the most powerful empire in the world at that moment, and proposed an alliance. The Tang saw the opportunity immediately. Eliminating Goguryeo had been a goal of Chinese dynasties for decades, and Silla was offering them a path to do it. The partnership formed, where later in 660 CE, Tang and Silla forces combined to defeat Baekje at the Battle of Hwangsanbeol. This was a decisive engagement that effectively ended Baekje as an independent power. Goguryeo was a different problem entirely, though. Its mountain fortresses and battle-hardened military made it extraordinarily difficult to crack. It took a coordinated north-south invasion and 6 more years of sustained warfare to break it. By 668 CE, Goguryeo collapsed, having been undone by the combination of external military pressure and internal civil conflict that had been building for years. But here's the twist that catches you off guard. The alliance between Silla and Tang didn't survive the victory. By 670 CE, just 2 years after Goguryeo's fall, the two former allies were at war with each other. The Tang dynasty wanted to govern the Korean peninsula directly, yet Silla had other ideas. The Silla-Tang War lasted 6 years and ended in 676 CE with a Silla victory, one of the more remarkable military and diplomatic achievements in Korean history. Given that Silla had just spent decades fighting alongside the Tang and was now successfully pushing the most powerful empire in the world off the peninsula, what followed was the unified Silla era, a period from 668 to 935 CE that many historians consider one of Korea's greatest in terms of cultural output. Buddhism flourished, so the arts reached new heights. The administrative systems that Silla had developed over centuries were extended across the entire peninsula, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become modern Korean civilization was laid in this period. But if you didn't know, the legacy of the three kingdoms didn't disappear when Silla unified the peninsula. It survived in the culture, in the institutions, ultimately in the DNA of what Korea became. Goguryeo defiant military tradition, Baekje's maritime sophistication and cultural generosity toward Japan, and Silla's long-game strategic thinking with its willingness to make the alliance that changed everything. All three of these shaped the Korea that came after them. With over 800 years of rivalry, three kingdoms started from the same people, the same language, the same peninsula, and built themselves into something distinct enough to fight each other for centuries. Throughout time, it was interconnected enough that when one finally won, it had to become all three to hold the country together. In short, that's Korean history and the explanation for the three separate kingdoms.